Imagine city gates hung with gruesome symbols of punishment, the remains of defeated enemies. In one officia, L inscription, the king declared, "I have severely punished the leaders who rebelled and turned their bodies into a warning to all by Deco, raiding the city walls with them." Thus begins the history of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 9th to 7th centuries BC. The era of Ashurbanipal II, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, a state that made cruelty the currency of its power. The surviving annals and bas-reliefs read like the diaries of executioners, but with royal seals. One ruler noted, "I deprived the prisoners of body parts, leaving them mutilated as an example to others." Another boasted, "I made sure that thousands of prisoners could no longer see the world." These were not legends of enemies, but official texts. Sometimes there was even a competition between kings to see who could describe their punishments more vividly. The Assyrians understood the psychology of fear perfectly. For them, war was not only conquest, but also a demonstration. A city that wanted to resist had to know that defeat meant not just loss, but horror that would remain in the memory of generations. Mass deportations became another weapon. Entire families of craftsmen and local elites were resettled to other parts of the empire. This reduced the risk of new uprisings and at the same time developed their capitals. Each siege ended with a show of force, what we would call today a psychological operation. The king could place a scene of mass execution next to his own portrait. This was his official photo for history. The Assyrians effectively turned terror into a state religion. Their armies were feared not only by warriors, but also by ambassadors, who returned home with horrific stories. And it is in this atmosphere of fear that a story begins which, even after 2,700 years, makes us question the very concept of civilization. Among all the methods of punishment used by the Assyrians, one became their horrific trademark, public executions, where enemies were deprived of the last protection of their bodies. Yes, you read that right. It was not a secret crime. On the contrary, the kings made a public demonstration of it, witnessed by thousands. Why did they do it openly? Because fear is cheaper than garrisons. A few scenes on the city walls were more effective at suppressing riots than thousands of soldiers. The annals of Ashurbanipal II preserve a direct quote, "I severely punished all the leaders who rebelled and made their bodies a warning by decorating the city walls with them." Imagine a gate with a gruesome reminder of the fate of the rebellious instead of coats of arms or symbols. For the inhabitants, it was daily proof that Assyria was not joking. Bas-reliefs from Nineveh show such scenes without embellishment. It was official art, a kind of advertisement for cruelty. For the Assyrians, it was not only an act of punishment, but also a strategic tool. Neighboring kings, hearing about this, thought twice about taking up arms. And the scariest thing was that this system worked. Terror truly broke the will of their opponents. The enemy saw not just an army, but a machine of fear, where even after death, your body did not belong to you. The Assyrians left a special mark in the conquered cities, pyramids made of the remains of their enemies, which served as monuments of submission. It was their demonstrative autograph of war. After the siege, the soldiers erected these eerie monuments near the city gates. Imagine, you enter a ruined city, and the first thing you see is a monument of fear that leaves no doubt about the power of Assyria. In the chronicles of King Ashurbanipal, we read, "I built a pyramid of enemy remains in front of the gates, and another one inside the city." This was not chaotic violence. It was a methodical signal. We are not only destroying your army, we are erasing your dignity, your memory, the very idea of resistance. Imagine a building whose facade is decorated with gruesome reminders of defeat. This is no exaggeration. According to some sources, in some cases, the remains of enemies could even become part of the architecture, built into the walls as symbols of victory. And most importantly, archaeologists confirm these practices. Evidence has been found in the ruins of Assyrian cities that such cruel acts were a reality, not the fabrications of enemies. The kings themselves considered them a source of pride. For the inhabitants of the conquered cities, these pyramids were not just a reminder of defeat. They were a daily encounter with fear. People lived next to monuments of intimidation that constantly repeated one thing: Assyria will return if you forget your lesson. The Assyrians did not limit themselves to one method. For them, punishment became almost an art form. Each king sought to invent new, even more terrifying forms of intimidation. Rebels were executed using one of the most painful and public methods, impalement on tall wooden stakes. Others could be tortured for hours in front of crowds, turning their execution into a spectacle. Prisoners were let out in cages, like wild animals. Enemies were humiliated by being forced to walk through the streets in chains, with painful metal hooks that restricted their freedom. People lost their human form, turning into humiliated creatures. Imagine a square where thousands of witnesses see the inglorious end of disobedience. But the worst awaited the children. In the rebellious cities, they were torn from their parents and sent into slavery. For the Assyrians, it was a double blow. Adults lost their heirs, and children became the property of the empire. These were not random outbreaks of cruelty. It was a well-thought-out theater. There was a crowd of spectators, a director, and a finale where the king stood in the center as the master of life and death. Execution became a political show that was more memorable than any speech. The Assyrians understood perfectly well that physical pain ends with death, but fear lives on. Therefore, they created a system of psychological terror that worked no worse than an army. Ambassadors from defeated kingdoms were forced to watch executions. Imagine, you have come for negotiations, but instead of being led to a banquet hall, you are taken to the city gates, where pyramids of enemy remains and the bodies of the executed are displayed. Your task is to return home and convey the exact lesson you have just seen. Now imagine that you are entering the capital of Assyria. You expect palatial luxury, but instead you see bas-reliefs depicting scenes of cruel punishments. This was their way of saying, here, power is absolute. Assyrian kings commissioned reliefs depicting the most horrific scenes, demonstrations of how enemies were punished, from skinning to mutilation and the display of bodies on stakes. They decorated their palaces with them, where gods or triumphs would normally be found. It was a kind of advertisement for future generations. This is how power works. Such reliefs were a museum of fear. They did not depict legends or myths. They were almost like news reports, created to impress ambassadors and remind subjects of the king's power. We see the same thing in cuneiform chronicles. Instead of dry descriptions of battles, there are detailed lists of punishments. I deprived them of their speech. I left them without limbs. I put their bodies on stakes. This was the official history of the empire, which future generations were to read. Even in peacetime, the Assyrians lived among walls decorated with images of cruelty. It was a daily reminder. The king sees everything, and his wrath knows no bounds. Now think, what would you do if you heard that the Assyrian army was already on the horizon? Most cities decided to surrender before the battle. There is a special figure in the history of Assyria, King Ashurbanipal. His name is known thanks to the world's first library, which he assembled in Nineveh. Tens of thousands of clay tablets with myths, laws, science, and literature. It is thanks to this collection that we know about the Epic of Gilgamesh and other masterpieces of Mesopotamia. He would seem to have been an enlightened ruler and patron of culture. But in his own chronicles, alongside the tablets, there are lines that make your blood run cold. Ashurbanipal writes, I placed their bodies on stakes so that everyone could see them. I cut out their tongues so that they could no longer speak against me. These were not enemies who wanted to discredit him. It was he himself who proudly recorded his methods of intimidation. In one text, the king lists the trophies of the library, and in the next, he describes the punished enemies who were executed on his orders. The paradox is that it is precisely because of his cultural passion that these descriptions have been preserved. We read not only about his love of knowledge, but also about how he personally ordered cruel punishments. The same collection of tablets that preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh also preserved official reports of violence. Thus, Ashurbanipal's library left behind two truths, the literature and myths of Mesopotamia, and at the same time, methods of terror. It is this combination of culture and cruelty that shapes our view of Assyria today. For Ashurbanipal, there was no contradiction between civilization and terror. He saw himself as both a guardian of wisdom and a ruler who ruled through fear. Imagine, a king who cared about literature and myths, while at the same time turning his empire into an arena for spectacular punitive performances. This paradox only emphasizes that in Assyria, terror was not an aberration, it was the norm. Even the most educated king considered it necessary to leave his descendants not only knowledge, but also methods of fear. When the Assyrians approached the walls of your city, you already knew that the end would not be just a defeat, but a catastrophe. They did not recognize half-victories. Each siege ended with a spectacle that was impossible to forget. Cuneiform texts preserve scenes that sound like horror movie scripts. After the city was taken, all men capable of bearing arms were executed without trial. Women and children were driven into slavery, separating families like herds of cattle. But it wasn't just about cruelty. The Assyrians were masters of military engineering. They built ramps, used battering rams, and even dug tunnels under the walls. Their enemies knew that these sieges were impossible to withstand. Any city that dared to resist was reduced to ashes. Temples were not spared. They were looted and burned, and priests were punished along with soldiers. Often, nothing remained after the destruction, only a wasteland with stakes and traces of the dead sticking out of it. The chronicles have preserved some truly chilling phrases. One of the kings boasted, "I wash my hands of the defeated." This was not a poetic metaphor, but a demonstrative signal. This is what the triumph of Assyria looks like. For the inhabitants of the conquered cities, such a sight was not just a tragedy, but humiliation in front of their own children. There are also bas-reliefs from Nineveh showing the siege of Lachish. Warriors carrying symbols of victory, crowds of women and children in chains, soldiers finishing off the resistance in the ruined city. These scenes, now preserved in the British Museum, document not a legend, but a real assault, executions, and deportation. And the message there is one: demonstrative punishment. Each siege was a lesson for other cities. The choice was simple: surrender immediately or become part of another bloody chronicle of victories. Most preferred to lay down their arms before the battle, knowing that the Assyrians would stop at nothing. Assyria built a huge empire, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. But its foundation was not peace and trade, but fear. Fear engraved in bas-reliefs. Fear that smelled of the ashes of cities and the suffering of prisoners. Each king sought to surpass his predecessor in cruelty, and it was this pursuit of glory that became a curse. Assyria's neighbors hated it so fiercely that when the moment came, they all united against it. In 612 BC, the Medes and Babylonians stormed Nineveh. They razed it to the ground, as if they wanted to erase the very word Assyria from human memory. Because when an empire lives on a credit of cruelty, the question always arises: who will turn off the lights and when? But it was impossible to forget it. Pyramids of intimidation, eerie symbols on city walls, bas-reliefs depicting punishments. All this remained in texts and archaeological finds. And even after almost 3,000 years, these images are more shocking than any fictional horrors of Game of Thrones. Thus, Assyria became a symbol of state terror. They were the first to make fear an official policy, to record scenes of punishment in state chronicles in the same way as military victories. Their empire fell, but the approach itself outlived it. From Rome to modern dictatorships, the methods of the Assyrians have been repeated over and over again. And so, when we remember ancient civilizations that left the world with laws or architecture, we must also remember another truth. There were those who left a legacy of horror. Assyria reminds us that power built on fear always falls, but the echoes of its methods live on through the centuries. Final appeal. The real Assyria is not just a state in the pages of textbooks. It is an empire that made cruelty its official policy and fear its currency. Their monuments of intimidation, scenes on walls, and bas-reliefs depicting punishments are not legends, but their pride, their calling card. Their empire fell, but the example remained. The Assyrians showed the world what happens when power turns violence into ideology. And even after 2,700 years, their methods sound more terrifying than any fictional story. If these facts have made you look at history with different eyes, subscribe. Because there are even more dark and shocking truths ahead that you definitely weren't taught in school.